Before you listen to this, let me say one thing clearly. I'm not here to motivate you. I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to tell you the truth I wish someone had told me earlier. Not when I was ready, but when I still had time to choose differently. I never imagined myself saying these words, but here I am, 60 years old, looking back at a life that moved faster than I ever realized while I was inside it. When you are young, time feels generous, almost obedient. You think it will wait for you. You think you can delay decisions, postpone happiness, ignore discomfort, and still somehow arrive exactly where you are meant to be. No one tells you that time is not patient, it is simply quiet. It doesn't warn you when a chapter is ending. It just turns the page. When I was in my 20s, I believed life was something that would eventually start. I treated the present like a waiting room. I thought real living would begin once I had more money, more confidence, more certainty. I didn't realize that waiting was already a choice, and it was costing me years. I chased validation like it was oxygen. Compliments felt like proof that I was doing something right. Criticism felt like a threat to my existence. I shaped myself to fit expectations I never agreed with but was too afraid to question. I confused approval with love and attention with worth. Nobody told me that the hunger for approval never gets satisfied, it only grows. The more you feed it, the more it demands. I worked jobs that drained me because they looked impressive on paper. I stayed loyal to places that did not respect me because I believed loyalty would eventually be rewarded. I tolerated disrespect because I told myself I was being mature. What I was really being was afraid. Afraid of starting over. Afraid of disappointing people. Afraid of admitting that I had outgrown certain rooms. I wish someone had told me earlier that fear doesn't disappear when you obey it. It gets stronger. It learns your patterns. It learns exactly how to keep you small. I spent so much energy trying to be useful that I forgot to be fulfilled. I said yes, automatically. I answered calls even when my body begged for rest. I wore exhaustion like a badge of honor, convinced that burning out meant I was doing something meaningful. Nobody warned me that burnout doesn't make you noble, it makes you numb. And numbness is dangerous because you stop noticing when your life is quietly drifting away from you. In my 30s, the noise slowed down just enough for me to hear myself think, and I didn't like what I heard. There was a persistent feeling that something was missing, but I couldn't name it. So I ignored it. I distracted myself with productivity, with routines, with responsibilities. I told myself I was lucky and that wanting more was ungrateful. What no one tells you is that gratitude and dissatisfaction can exist at the same time. You can appreciate what you have and still admit that something feels wrong. Ignoring that feeling doesn't make it disappear, it just pushes it deeper. I stayed in relationships that felt familiar rather than nourishing. I mistook comfort for connection. I avoided difficult conversations because I didn't want to rock the boat, not realizing I was slowly drilling holes into it instead. Silence felt safer than honesty, until silence became loneliness. I wish someone had told me that peace built on suppression is fragile. It cracks eventually. I also wish someone had told me that not every ending needs to be dramatic to be necessary. Some endings are quiet realizations that you are no longer growing. Leaving doesn't always mean something went wrong, sometimes it means something finally went right. I thought endurance was strength. I thought staying meant commitment. It took me decades to understand that real strength is choosing yourself without needing permission. By the time I reached my 40s, I started noticing how quickly years passed. Days blended together. Weeks disappeared. I would look back and struggle to remember entire seasons of my life because I was mentally elsewhere when they happened. I was either replaying the past or worrying about the future, rarely fully present. Nobody tells you that presence is not automatic, it is a practice. And the cost of being absent is that your life happens without you. I began to realize that most of my regrets weren't about mistakes, they were about hesitation. Opportunities one didn't take because I wasn't ready. Words I didn't say because I didn't want to seem difficult. Dreams I postponed because they felt impractical. Practicality can be a beautiful thing, but it can also be a cage if you use it to suffocate your desires. I wish someone had told me earlier that clarity doesn't come before action, it comes after. Waiting to feel ready is often just fear pretending to be wisdom. I also learned that people don't remember your sacrifices the way you think they will. They remember how you showed up, not how much you gave up. I poured myself into others believing it would secure my place in their lives, but self-abandonment never creates security, it creates resentment. And resentment, when ignored, turns inward. It shows up as bitterness, fatigue, and a quiet anger you can't explain. I blamed myself for things that were never mine to carry. I took responsibility for other people's emotions, choices, and failures. Nobody told me that empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Caring deeply does not mean carrying everything. As I approached 60, one truth became impossible to ignore: time does not slow down just because you are uncomfortable. It does not pause while you figure things out. It keeps moving, indifferent to your excuses. And one day you wake up and realize that the life you thought you were preparing for is the one you are already living. That realization can be terrifying, or it can be liberating. I wish someone had told me earlier that joy is not a reward you earn after suffering long enough. It is not scheduled for later. Later is not guaranteed. Joy is something you allow, something you choose, even when circumstances are imperfect. If I could sit across from my younger self now, I wouldn't give them a list of rules. I would tell them this: stop waiting for permission to take your own life seriously. Stop shrinking yourself to fit places that no longer fit you. Stop confusing exhaustion with importance. And stop believing that you have endless time to become who you want to be. You are becoming someone every day, whether you are conscious of it or not. Choose wisely. Somewhere in your 40s, life stops whispering and starts asking questions you can no longer ignore. Not out loud, not dramatically, but persistently. Questions like, is this really how you want to live? Is this who you are, or just who you became to survive? I remember waking up one morning and realizing that I felt tired even before the day had started. Not physically, but emotionally. A deep fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. That was the moment I understood that exhaustion is not always about effort. Sometimes it's about misalignment. Nobody tells you that living against yourself is the most draining thing you can do. I had built a life that looked stable, respectable, and acceptable, yet something inside me felt increasingly distant. I was doing everything right, but nothing felt right. In my earlier years, I believed discomfort meant I needed to push harder. In my 40s, I finally realized discomfort is sometimes a signal to stop. I had ignored that signal for years. I had learned how to endure, how to adapt, how to silence my needs. I called it maturity. In reality, it was survival mode disguised as responsibility. One of the hardest truths I had to face was that no one was coming to save me from the life I was tolerating. I kept waiting for circumstances to change, for people to change, for clarity to arrive. What no one tells you is that clarity often comes after you disappoint people, not before. Every boundary you avoid setting becomes a lesson you have to repeat later, usually at a higher cost. I avoided conflict because I wanted peace, but all I achieved was delayed confrontation. And delayed confrontation always comes louder. Relationships started to shift. Some grew deeper because honesty finally entered the room. Others faded because they were built on versions of me that no longer existed. I used to see endings as failures. Now I see many of them as overdue conclusions. Not everything that ends is broken. Some things end because they have fulfilled their purpose. Holding on out of nostalgia is a quiet form of fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of starting again. Fear of admitting that you chose wrong. I wish someone had told me earlier that choosing wrong doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Refusing to adjust when you know better is what keeps you stuck. I also learned that resentment rarely announces itself. It builds slowly, fed by unspoken expectations and unmet needs. I expected people to notice my effort, my sacrifice, my loyalty. When they didn't, I felt hurt, then angry, then distant. It took me years to understand that expectations you never communicate become resentments you can't explain. Nobody teaches you how to ask for what you need without apologizing for existing. I was generous with my time, my energy, my support, but I was terrible at receiving. I thought independence meant never needing anyone. That belief cost me closeness. True independence is knowing you can ask for help without losing yourself. Around this time, my body started speaking louder than my thoughts. Tension became pain. Stress became insomnia. My body was carrying everything I refused to process emotionally. Nobody tells you that the body keeps records. You can ignore your feelings, but your nervous system doesn't forget. Health is not just about what you eat or how much you move. It's about how safe you feel in your own life. It's about rest, boundaries, and the ability to say no without explaining yourself. I used to feel guilty resting, as if stillness needed to be justified. Now I know rest is not laziness, it is maintenance. Ignore maintenance long enough and everything breaks. Money also took on a different meaning in my 40s. I had spent years believing more money would equal more freedom. What I didn't notice was how often I traded freedom to chase more money. Longer hours, constant availability, postponed joy. I told myself it was temporary. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent if you're not paying attention. Nobody tells you that enough is not a number, it's a boundary. And if you never define what enough means, you will always feel behind, no matter how much you have. Some of my loudest regrets weren't about failure, they were about delay. The trip I postponed until things settled down. The creative ideas I labeled unrealistic. The conversations I avoided because they felt uncomfortable. Comfort is seductive, but it comes with a price. It shrinks your world quietly. I also learned that loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from being surrounded by people who don't really see you. That kind of loneliness is heavier than solitude. Solitude can be nourishing. It gives you space to hear yourself again. Loneliness in company slowly erodes your sense of self. This is when I started choosing depth over quantity. Fewer relationships, but more honest ones. Fewer commitments, but more intentional ones. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. I stopped chasing understanding from those unwilling to listen. I wish someone had told me earlier that being misunderstood is not a personal failure. Sometimes it's the cost of growth. I also wish someone had told me that the voice in your head is not always telling the truth. It often repeats old fears in a familiar tone. It sounds like logic, but it's usually just conditioning. You are allowed to question it. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to want something different, even if the old version of you worked hard to build this life. Growth does not require loyalty to outdated dreams. By the end of my 40s, one thing became clear: time feels faster not because it actually moves faster, but because you finally understand its value. You stop wasting it on people who drain you, on arguments that lead nowhere, on lives that don't feel like yours. Or at least, you start trying to. And that effort alone changes everything. By the time you reach 60, something shifts permanently. The noise fades. The urgency dissolves. You stop performing your life and start witnessing it. You no longer ask what looks good, you ask what feels honest. And honesty, I learned, is both liberating and uncomfortable. It strips away excuses. It removes the luxury of pretending you don't know better. At this age, you know. You know what drains you. You know what you're avoiding. You know which relationships are built on habit rather than connection. And knowing changes the rules. I used to think wisdom meant having answers. Now I understand it means asking better questions. The most important one being, can I live with this version of myself? That question cuts through everything. It exposes compromises you've normalized. It reveals choices you made out of fear rather than alignment. It forces you to confront the quiet truth that many of us live lives designed to be acceptable rather than authentic. I wish someone had told me earlier that authenticity is not loud or dramatic. It's subtle. It shows up in the decisions you make when no one is watching. In the boundaries you keep even when they inconvenience others. In the courage to disappoint people instead of betraying yourself. I spent too many years confusing peace with avoidance. Real peace is not the absence of conflict, it's the absence of inner contradiction. When your actions and values align, life feels lighter even when it's difficult. I learned that peace is the real success. Not titles. Not applause. Not recognition. Those things fade quickly. Peace stays. It sits with you at night when distractions are gone. It determines how you sleep, how you age, how you relate to yourself. I also learned that comparison is a thief that never retires. Even at 60, you can fall into the trap of measuring your life against someone else's highlight reel. But comparison ignores context. It ignores unseen struggles, different starting points, invisible sacrifices. The moment I stopped comparing timelines, I started appreciating my own. There is no universal schedule for life. You are not late. You are not behind. You are simply on your own path. One of the most painful realizations came when I understood how much time I spent worrying about what people thought of me. Opinions that changed easily. judgments that were never informed. I shaped my choices around imagined reactions. I wish someone had told me earlier that most people are too busy managing their own fears to analyze yours. And even when they do judge, it says more about them than it ever will about you. Freedom begins when you stop auditioning for approval. I also wish someone had told me that love is not found, it is built. Slowly. Through presence, attention, and effort. Love is not grand gestures or dramatic promises. It's consistency. It's showing up when it's inconvenient. It's listening without planning your response. It's choosing the same person again, not because it's easy, but because it's meaningful. And love also includes knowing when to let go. Staying in relationships that require you to disappear is not love, it's fear. I learned that grief is not limited to death. You grieve versions of yourself you never became. Futures that didn't happen. Choices you didn't make. That grief deserves space. Ignoring it doesn't make it weaker, it makes it heavier. Allowing yourself to mourn what could have been creates room for what still can be. I also learned that joy is not irresponsible. It doesn't need to be justified or postponed. I spent years treating joy like a reward for endurance. Finish this first, survive that phase, then you can rest. Then you can enjoy. Later became a moving target. Later is a dangerous word. It convinces you that life is waiting. It isn't. Life is happening right now, in the middle of unfinished tasks and unresolved questions. Joy is not the opposite of responsibility, it's what makes responsibility sustainable. At 60, your body reminds you daily that it is not infinite. Energy becomes valuable. Recovery takes longer. And you begin to understand that how you live matters more than how long you live. I wish someone had told me earlier to listen to my body instead of overriding it. Pain is information. Fatigue is communication. Rest is not weakness, it is wisdom. You don't earn rest by suffering enough. You require it because you are human. I also learned that forgiveness is not about excusing harm, it's about releasing yourself from carrying it forever. Holding on to anger feels powerful until you realize it's costing you peace. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It means choosing not to let the past dictate your present. One of the greatest lessons of aging is learning how to be alone without feeling lonely. Solitude becomes a sanctuary rather than a threat. You stop fearing your own thoughts. You start enjoying your own company. That relationship with yourself is the longest one you will ever have. Neglect it, and no amount of external success will compensate. Nurture it, and even difficult seasons become manageable. I wish someone had told me earlier that you don't need to have everything figured out to move forward. Clarity often follows action, not the other way around. Waiting to feel ready is often just fear dressed as patience. Small, imperfect steps change lives. So do small, repeated acts of self-respect. The way you speak to yourself matters. The standards you accept matter. The courage to choose differently matters. At 60, you finally understand that time is not something you lose all at once. You lose it in pieces. In distractions. In avoidance. In postponement. And you also gain it back in pieces. In presence. In honesty. In alignment. If I could leave you with one truth, it would be this: your life does not need to be extraordinary to be meaningful. It needs to be yours. Fully owned. Fully lived. Stop waiting for permission. Stop postponing what matters. Stop betraying yourself in small ways and calling it. Compromise. You are not running out of time today, but you are spending it. Spend it like it matters. Because one day, sooner than you think, you will look back and realize that this moment was part of your life too. If this made you stop and think, don't ignore that feeling. It means this lesson was meant for you. Subscribe, not because you have to, but because there are more truths coming that most people only realize too late. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Sometimes one honest message can change the direction of a life.